Hey, what's up, Unbroken Nation? I think that there's some truth that the truth will set you free. And I want to go into that a little bit deeper here because I want to know about the impact that going on this journey has actually had in your life.
Wow. It has, if you had told me 8 years ago I'd be doing today what I'm doing now, I would have laughed you off the face of the earth because I mentioned a retreat program I'm part of. I went into that first retreat calling myself the holy exception. I'm a Christian, so my life's based off the Bible. And I went in saying that everything in the Bible was good enough for everybody else but me. I was too screwed up, too far gone. I was a waste of space. I was imploding again. And I went in with that mindset. And just through the opportunity to be, through the opportunity to be real and to kind of start taking off those masks. And we talked a lot about having to forgive ourselves. And that's a hard part. That's a critical part of this healing and the grieving. You talked about needing to grieve our stories. I did not realize how much loss my story has. And some of this I learn about myself the more I speak. When I say I didn't have a chance to have a normal childhood, that's more of a realization that's come up in the last year. And I think I knew that, but I didn't know how to put words to it. But it starts making more sense. So I think that the whole grief journey is a critical part of our stories that cannot be bypassed. I had different times where I just totally lost it. My greatest fear was realized, and my greatest fear was shattered all at the same time. My greatest fear, and probably the same for many of your listeners, if I tell somebody, I'm going to cry and I'm never going to stop. And that was my greatest fear. And yeah, I cried and I cried hard and I'm like heaving, crying for 10 minutes. And yet that circle of friends you talked about came beside me. They knew what was going on and they just loved me and accepted me and let me cry. And they grieved with me. And then my greatest fear stopped. I did stop because at some point in time, that well of grief will empty. It may not fully empty. There's still little things like now, when it comes back, but it's not a debilitating grief. It's more of a sadness and a thankfulness for the healing that has happened. I never want to be disconnected from the emotion of everything I have gone through because I disconnected myself emotionally for decades, for over 4 decades. Because again, I just went into recovery from an eating disorder in 2016. So I had all that time where I didn't know how to deal with emotions. I never want to disconnect again. But because of the hard work, those emotions don't overtake me to the point that I can't control them. The anger I feel at the injustice that was done to me is no longer rage. I have reached a point, and for some, sounds really weird, but I have reached a point where I am able to have compassion against my rapist. Not everybody gets to that point, but I'm able to get to that point now because my situation happened in the early 70s. Rape was not on the radar. It wasn't something to be discussed. No one knew to ask anything, and I didn't know to say anything. So if it wasn't on the radar for me, what was Bobby experiencing where he acted out on it? That was an angle it took me a long time to get through and to get to. And not everybody gets there. And you're not expected to get there. That's just where I've ended up with my work. But that is the power of grief because until we own our story, we can't grieve our story. That first year at retreat, that's what happens. I owned my story. I was in denial about my story. I hated my story and I hated myself. And I didn't think I was lovable because I had no experience saying I was lovable. far as I knew, nobody cared because they sure had a funny way of showing it. And I left that experience of being around these people knowing that I had some value. But mostly, I learned to start forgiving myself. Not that I did anything wrong that day, but forgiving myself and letting myself off the hook for not dealing with it up to now. So, and healing, when Michael and I were saying that those first 3 years of healing are hell, this is what we mean. This is some of the stuff, the gut level stuff that has to be worked through in order to be able to start building on that foundation. Because you're not going to believe that you're worthy if you're still blaming yourself for something. And you might be blaming yourself for something that's a total lie. But it's truth to us because that's all we've ever known until we have other people in our lives come in and help shatter that lie and start speaking that truth to us. Because just like Michael said, it's the truth that sets us free. And we have to set that story straight. We've told ourselves a story about what happened ever since it happened. But that story isn't fully accurate. And that's what has to get worked out. And that's where that gut-wrenching first few years comes in, because you're facing your story. And that means letting somebody challenge you to the different characters that are in it. And did this person really play that role? And what role did you really play? Okay, so for me, it came into blaming myself. I woulda, shoulda, coulda. I lived in woulda, shoulda, coulda land for so long. And I learned that I was putting 50-year-old expectations on a 7-year-old. And I wasn't being fair. I wasn't helping that 7-year-old little girl heal. That 7-year-old little girl was just, thinking, hey, cool, there's something to see in the woods. Childhood curiosity. But I had to forgive myself for that because, again, not that I did anything wrong, but the story I had told myself is what was wrong. And that's where I had to let myself off the hook so that I could then own the real story of what happened, put the responsibility where it really belonged, and continue to own that. And then start feeling that grief so that I could work through that and finally realize that the rape was not my fault. That was the hardest homework my counselor ever gave me. When I first told her, when we were first dealing with it, was 10 times a day, look in the mirror and say out loud, the rape was not my fault. And up to then, I had said, it wasn't my fault. And she's like, no, not it. Name it. The rape was not my fault. And the first 2 days, it was, the rape was not my fault. The rape was not my fault. Very dispassionate. And then I started changing, the rape was not my fault. The rape was not my fault. The rape was not my fault. And it became emphasis on different words. And now it's truth. It was true before, but now I believe it. That's some of the stuff that we're talking about.